Brush to make sure any weird artifacts from remeshing are gone. And now it's painting time. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using the sculpt mode development branch, meaning I have access to the sculpt mode vertex paints, which I use to paint the model. It's very practical because they're way faster than the regular vertex paints, and they don't require me to retopologize or unwrap anything. I start out by painting everything with a base orangish color and then add a slightly darker shade for the darker tufts of hair around the back of his neck and the top of his head. Then I go in with a beige and paint in the fluffy fur around his cheeks, the bottom of his jaw, and the front of his neck. I also paint the back of his ears darker, which is what foxes have, and paint the insides lighter later too. For this part of the process especially, but even early on, it's very good to have references open of actual foxes as well as some other artists' drawings of characters like this to get a good idea of how you want to make the colors look and stuff. For the most part, we really don't know how stuff looks off the top of our heads, even if it's something we were very familiar with, so just having some pictures of them out while painting or sculpting them really makes it easier to figure out how they should look, and the finished result usually looks a lot better. Now obviously he looks very different from a real fox, and he's my character, so there isn't any art of him yet, so I still have to make some decisions for myself, such as do I want the edge to the white to be a smooth gradient, or do I want it to be a sharp edge? I also have to add the color to the more finicky parts, such as where there are like small tight creases and stuff, and it's easy to paint on the wrong side of the model. But eventually I get all the color where it should be and get everything properly cleaned up. I also add some darker shades around his eyes, and also finally get around to painting the eyes their proper color. I had originally painted them gray, just kind of as a placeholder so I can see where he's looking, but now I paint them in blue, first adding just a base coat, then adding some darker shades, and finally some gradients and highlights for details. I also add in that marking that foxes have at the side of their snout. I make it a bit stylized so it doesn't really look exactly how real foxes have it, but that doesn't matter, it's a stylized character. And now I also paint his nose. It took me a while to get the color quite right, but eventually I got something I liked. And now to his eyes. Foxes have quite dark circles almost around their eyes, and I tried to implement something like that for him, but putting it on the bottom looked slightly weird, so I kept it to the top and to the corner of his eye. I also painted in the line for the mouth, to make that a bit darker and more visible. And then I carefully used my grab brush to add a little bit of asymmetry to his expression. And now I add some little details to his eyes. I modeled some tiny little crosses because I want him to be a kind of medic character, and I put those in his eyes as highlights. I always like having little highlights, fake highlights that kind of reflect something about the character's personality. You'll see that in some of my older sculpts, and I did that here too. And I painted his shirt. I went with a dark navy that kind of matches his eyes but doesn't call attention away from them. And I go back to the fur and add some very slight highlights just to add a little bit more depth. I do that a bit more in some of my other sculpts, but I didn't really feel like putting that much time into these ones. I added a little bit more detail to the shirt, adding some highlights and a little bit of a gradienty kind of shadow deal around the bottom. And with that, the painting is done, and I move on to some quick lighting and rendering. I already have my lighting setup saved in my startup file, which is just a backlight and a key light and a basic plane for the backdrop. So I can quickly add my vertex colors to a material, tweak the colors of the lights and stuff a bit, change around some settings to make everything work right, and with that, he is already done. And here he is.